The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome everyone. For those that have dialed in a few minutes early, we will get started here on the Conformance and Certification Community Kickoff in just a few minutes. I'm going to stay on mute, and you should be able to see a screen right now. If you can, let me know with the slide deck, and we'll get started here in just a few minutes. Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for the official community launch of ADL's conformance and certification efforts for the Experience API. My name is Jason Haig. I'm a systems engineering and technical advisor for the ADL initiative. I'm joined today by aaronesilvers and Megan Bowe from the Data Interoperability Standards Consortium, also known as DISC. Many of you know Aaron and Megan as leaders in the xAPI community, and Aaron as the previous manager of the community during his time here at ADL. We're here today to update you and invite you to help in our efforts to accelerate xAPI conformance and certification requirements. If you will change to the next slide. So for your awareness, I'll briefly cover some of the conformance testing efforts that have been underway already in 2016, as well as some future plans this year. Then I'll hand it over to Aaron, as he is leading efforts to engage the community for conformance and certification as part of a BAA contract here with ADL. He'll also brief you on some of the upcoming deliverables, the approach that's being taken, and how you, the community, can also help with all these efforts over this year and going into the next calendar year. We will be using the question panel within the GoToMeeting interface to solicit questions. If any of you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to send them. We'll have some time at the end to try to answer all of those. This meeting is also being recorded, so we'll share out a link for those interested in contributing this effort, but unfortunately could not attend today's kickoff meeting. Okay, if you want to change to the next slide. So a little bit of background and history, just to give you all an update of what all has taken place going back as far as 2013, maybe before. We've all known as a community there was a need for some conformance testing for xAPI to reach a level of maturity that we wanted. As far back as I can remember, 2013 at the Plug Fest is when some initial talks began. Andy Johnson, one of the spec leads from ADL, the spec lead from ADL, began identifying and documenting these requirements for the community in 2014. There's a link there. It's up on GitHub in the ADL, one of the ADL repositories, if any of you'd like to see those requirements. And since then, we've had some major software testing contributions from Rusticity Software and Riptide Software in 2014, 2015. Next slide. And since then, we've been a little bit stagnant and now have really decided that we need to kick efforts off again and accelerate things. One of the main drivers of that was the new DoD instruction. Many of you may know the Department of Defense issuance 1322.26 addressed the delivery, management, and development of content, and mostly addressed SCORM and how DoD services could develop content to be interoperable. We needed to do some major revisions to the DoD. We've been working on that at ADL this year, and one of the main things we've done is added the ability to enable people to adopt xAPI in the services. We also reaffirmed ADL's position as leader in supporting the services and research and development of learning technology, and also instantiated the requirement to be involved with DADLAC, which is a governing body for all the services that are involved with learning and technology. And one of the things that was identified during these updates to the DoD was that there was a need to update the test suite. So we also launched an internal development team at ADL to start working on the software development test suite, leveraging existing efforts from Rusticity Software and Riptide and all the work that's been done leading up to this year. One of the things we wanted to also try to accomplish is to re-engage the community for conformance and certification, and we're letting DISC lead the charge in those efforts. Also, we need to re-verify all the use cases for LRS Conformance Test Suite, as well as identify the implicit and explicit requirements. Some of those were identified in that document I mentioned earlier that Andy had started on. So it's really just an effort for us to, as a community, do our due diligence and really identify those requirements with you, the community, that have been documented. And then upcoming efforts this year also around developing process and requirements for certification, and also an index of products, and then also future research around xAPI profile testing capability and whether that's feasible, and what aspects of profiles could be tested and so forth. But right now the initial focus is on LRS conformance testing. So with that said, I will turn it over to Aaron and let him brief you on how you all can get involved and what's going on. Aaron?
Thanks, Jason, and hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be able to talk to you guys today. Let me get started here. So, at a high level, with as little geek speak as I can make it, what I wanted to address, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to establish some common expectations for data interoperability and data sovereignty. And we talk about that in terms of data ownership, like how do organizations own their data, how do people own their data? And secondly, we want to evaluate and recognize via certification the technologies and the practitioners that can demonstrate in repeatable ways meeting the expectations of xAPI from multiple stakeholders. So currently, if we want to talk about all the different systems that use xAPI and how they conform to the spec, it's largely mediated socially. It's been, through the participation by all these software vendors in our online forums, in the weekly calls that are facilitated by ADL, in, the client interactions that vendors have where they're literally making their products work with other products. And when you only have about 6 main LRS vendors participating, this is sufficient for now. The challenge, though, is that there's no realistic way for a third party to evaluate the interoperability of these systems, and for consumers of LRS software, IT administrators, people like that, who don't participate in these forums and calls. There's no independent means to identify what actually works and what does even working mean, when we're talking about xAPI. So what we want to do is take a much more broader, I would say, research approach towards what does interoperability mean and how do we prove that something is interoperable. So first, we want to describe the expectations from a stakeholder perspective for interoperability, and draw from as broad and as an international community that we can in terms of like the different types of people that are getting involved from different nations, coming together from different industries, from different job categories, different levels within organizations, etc. And then we want to determine, based on those kinds of responses about like just those expectations, what are those expectations that are supported directly by the spec, which we would lump as like a conformance requirement, and what must be demonstrated in practice, and so it kind of goes beyond the spec, which maybe points towards certification requirements. And then after that, we determine how those expectations are supported specifically by the LRS, or demonstrated specifically by the practitioners or the learning record providers, and maybe how other expectations might require other technologies, or simply just aren't ready to bake or don't apply. Our hope is that this approach realizes really the full potential for testing for technical conformance to the spec, while delivering on, I would say, stakeholder expectations of turnkey interoperability. It's something that I think that the promise of SCORM going back 12 or 15 years was there in terms of like, if it's certified, that means this is just going to work. And we know in practice that it took a long time to get to that point. We want to try and circumvent the time it takes to go from baseline technical conformance to delivering on customer expectations of what conformance means. And we need to think about that. That has impacts down the road. So who cares about this? Well, there's a couple different perspectives. Vendors care, especially those who have invested in the development of xAPI for the last couple of years. Stakeholders like the U.S. Department of Defense care. And the reason why they care is because if we succeed, we save people who adopt xAPI technologies billions of dollars a year in time spent on testing and troubleshooting integrations. And if we succeed, from a spec community perspective, the adoption of xAPI across learning and human performance applications is just going to grow and keep growing. And that's going to lower the cost of commercial off-the-shelf software for the Department of Defense and anybody else who's interested in adopting xAPI tools and technologies, and increase the market options available to, so you end up with like a more diverse ecosystem of different tools that do distinct things that all work together. So how long is it going to take for us to get the work that we have with ADL done? It's not the limit of what the disk is going to do, but for our purposes today, we're going to talk specifically about the work that we're doing in collaboration with ADL. We have a very short timeline for conformance requirements, which is why I'm so glad to have so many of you are joining us today for this kickoff. We have a fairly tight schedule around developing recommendations for a certification program related specifically to the learning record stores. And then we develop DISC will develop an index of certified products, and most of 2007, the first half of 2017, a majority of our focus is going to be on figuring out what professional certification program or programs might be helpful or necessary in order to improve data help deliver on data interoperability. So you can see here from this timetable on this slide, there's already been quite a bit of work already done this year. There's been conformance use cases, there's been a report on conformance use cases, there's been a test suite in development, there's an analysis that is just getting wrapped up by REST Software and their BA effort. It's an independent effort from what we're doing, which is definitely where REST side is a very technical focus. We are, in looking at the existing conformance requirements, we're validating those requirements and making sure that we have everything accounted for from a whole industry, whole community perspective. And then the results of both of our efforts will be merged and then, produce a robust, set of conformance requirements. That then informs the beta software that ADL is putting out in terms of its test suite. And then you can see down the line that we get into the recommendations for, a certification program. It starts getting into the development of an index of certified products so that, when there are certified products, it becomes pretty easy for everybody to identify what they are and where to find. And there's one definitive place of where to go. So our approach. I think it's important for us to think about the question of how xAPI's data interoperability should work by considering the fact that what we're embarking on in terms of developing conformance testing and certification testing, software certification testing, even professional certification testing, is going to have impacts, at least for the next 30 years, on a learning technology industry that is adopted as like a meta level across many other practices. We can understand that because SCORM's been around almost 20 years from its very first origins in like 97, and we know that it's still going strong and not going away anytime soon. And so the legacy of the things that have been done in terms of its, catalyzing its adoption and making it, developing conformance and certification are all part of why SCORM is so entrenched in, the technologies that are used in organizations around the world today. We see that kind of future for xAPI, and we want to be cognizant of it and respect that. So when we think about how xAPI's data interoperability should work, we're not looking at this as a one-and-done activity. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. But we are looking at that big picture, and so we want people to respond to that question with ideas and suggestions that are based on your expectations of wherever you're at, right? And it really gets to the point of how will we know that interoperability actually meets those expectations, right? If we want to have software tests, we need to confirm that we actually have a common set of conformance requirements to the spec. So we identify the ways in which we say this is what the spec says, in practice ways. To certify products and people, we need to identify the additional requirements that account for stakeholder needs, and they may be more related to the user experience or the practice of developing or designing things with xAPI or the analysis of data that's generated with xAPI. That's a research activity that we're going to undertake. With these kinds of requirements, then we can inform the design of certification programs so that third parties, beyond the customers and the vendors, can confirm that these technologies actually work together. So let's talk a little bit about how we'd like you guys to engage, because we are really hoping that you're going to jump on board and help us fill it in, all sorts of ideas and suggestions around like what this means. We took a page from the original Project Tin Can, where they had an idea board post up there, and it was really successful. And we see that kind of open-ended, easy to use approach as being highly valuable to answer the question about what does xAPI's data interoperability mean? Like, how should that actually work? We also have a separate idea board that's very specifically for the nerds. and you know who you are. We're there too. All right. It is really to get into the weeds of line item by line item. What are the conformance requirements in the spec? I'm going to take a pause here, and I'm going to kind of break out of this this presentation and show you exactly what these boards look like. Okay. So if we take a look at xAPI's data interoperability research, we already see that there's a couple of suggestions put up here. Okay. And they could be about really, this board is meant to be really greenfield. Put in whatever it is that matches your expectations. Maybe not all of it is going to translate into requirements, but it will inform the requirements that get generated. Because, as I stated before, what work of discerning what the spec supports is going to be mediated by a technical working group and DISC. And we're going to take that burden off of the general public, who I think has a lot of ideas about how things should work together. When it comes to the scope of what the spec actually says and how to conform to it, all right, we're going to look line item by line item at some of the probably about 460, it looks like 463 requirements that have been documented so far, and that may not be all of them. I want to open up one and kind of demonstrate, how these are formatted and how this works. So, for example, let's take a look at this one on statement of authority. There's a bunch of numbers in here, little with lots of periods. And, what we've done is we've cross-referenced, to the 1.0.2 spec. And we've also cross-referenced 0.3 version of the spec, which is forthcoming in its release, like probably in the next week or two. Anybody can submit requirements to this board. The way you do that, whether you want to log in and ask for your email address, or you subscribe and ask for your email address, or you want to vote on something, it's going to ask for your email address, or you want to post a comment, it's going to ask for your email address. You're going to want to put in an email address. So if I subscribe, if I log in and I put in I'll ask you for your full name. And they'll pull in from Gravatar, your icon, you should pull in from Gravatar, whatever image is associated with your email address. And now I can vote as I want to. I can post a comment here and there. I can even submit a new requirement, such as LRSs should look like bunnies. And why? What details? Well, cute and cuddly LRS bunnies are the bomb. Now, you don't need to choose a category for any of these requirements, but we have set a requirement to actually tag things of things that are defined by the spec, implied by the spec, or maybe not in the spec. And if you can go into more detail as to where things might go, that would be helpful in helping us organize. And then we can share this requirement, which I've now done. And that's really how this works. It's the exact same operation in terms of xAPI's data interoperability research board there. So with that said, let's go back to the presentation. And well, we're going to have weekly calls to talk specifically about those technical requirements. They're going to be on Thursdays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern. That means tomorrow as well. And we have a go-to meeting for that, and obviously a call-in if you don't want to use GoToMeeting directly. And the way that that's going to work is to actually look through the boards and start reviewing and organizing these ideas and suggestions and vet them into requirements. And also make sure that the things that we are listing as requirements in that technical board are actually the requirements that we want to have and the wording that we want to have them in. Okay.
Hey, Aaron, I think we're missing your screen. I don't think it's sharing back your slide deck. It's okay. Okay.
Thanks.
And what was? Yeah, maybe go to that last slide or whatever you were just talking to, because I think we missed it. Yeah, the calls. Okay.
Sorry about that. So yes, the weekly requirements calls. We're going to have those on Thursdays, 10:30 a.m. Eastern. These slides will also are publicly available, and we'll make sure that the link gets sent out to all of you. As well as if you go to datainteroperability.org, all of this information is on the landing page for that. The listserv that we'll be using in terms of discussion will be the existing xAPI spec mailing list. There's probably over 100 people who already belong to that list. It is pretty much everybody who's been actively involved in the spec is available, and it makes it easy for all of us to be able to communicate openly together. And that list is publicly available. You don't even need to subscribe to the mailing list in order to follow it. You just go to the link here, the short link, and it'll take you to the list, and you can read whether or not you're a member. And finally, I would say, before we go to questions that may be coming in from the board, reach out to Jason Hager or myself with any questions, any feedback that you have, any concerns that you have. I think if you're new to the xAPI community, you may not know me, and that's cool. If you are in the xAPI community, I hope you understand that, the door is open for, any concerns that you have around, or questions that you have around what we're doing and what we're going to be doing, and welcome your feedback. Jason, do you have anything else?
Yeah, Aaron, we had a few questions come in. We've been trying to answer those as much as possible, and we'll post a follow-up link to these questions that were answered, as well as some of the links that Aaron provided in the slide decks. Actually, we'll just share out your slide decks, I think, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar for those that missed it or joined late. So we had a question come in here from, I think a lot of them were answered. One specifically recently from Ingo Don. He said, can you give an example of a requirement outside of the spec that is to be tested? If a requirement is important and so precise that is to be tested, why shouldn't it go into the spec?
Well, I guess, you'll have. I will give an example, albeit it is not technically precise in what I will say, mostly because I'm not thinking about this yet, and this hasn't been vetted yet as it should. But for example, one of the suggestions that we popped up on the idea board was the idea that there should be a definitive way to be able to send data from one LRS to another in terms of an interface. There's not any interface requirements in the spec itself, as far as I understand, and to that, at this point, it would be a breaking change to the spec. But in practice of developing an LRS, if you were certifying a product that's based on expectations, that might be a requirement that we might demand of products that are being certified. And while yes, that probably, if it was that important, probably should be rolled into the spec, and perhaps that's the maturity level of how that would go, is to kind of caveat that in terms of product certification. That's an example, albeit again not the most specific and most technical that I can make it. All right. I hope that at least gives some answer. Some answer, some help to that. Other questions?
Yeah. So I believe to add to that, maybe a good example, to get at that question too, is that there's explicit requirements, but there's some that are kind of implied that may not be completely the same. That like for example, the ISO date time spec. There's different types. We need some consistency around that. So maybe that's more of an example that would help Ingo out there. I had another comment from Andrew Downs. He said a stream of statement story is not in the spec but needed for the data to be useful. I'm not quite sure. I think he was responding also to that question from Ingo.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see any others coming in. If you can go back maybe a slide or two, Aaron, to share some of those resources for those that were looking at links or contact information.
Right. So again, our weekly calls go in earnest starting tomorrow. There's a GoToMeeting link. There's a dial-in number in access code. If you don't want to jump on GoToMeeting, or you're in the car and you just want to hear the dulcet sounds of spec nerds geeking out while you're on your morning drive, that's all fine.
Yep. More questions coming in here. What are the requirements for a third party to run certification program or testing for any LRS conforming to standards?
At this time, we have no requirements because we have no certification test for third parties to run. So that is part of the work that we're going to produce in terms of making recommendations for a certification program by the end of this calendar year.
Okay. Excellent.
That's not being elusive. I'm being just honest. We don't have.
Yep. That's in the works. So that's another part of this effort, certification. Okay. Another question: will the specs have an impact on information assurance in networks?
I mean, this is obviously an opinion and not one based on policies that have been set in motion. But I would suspect that yes. I mean, we are. There are a number of activities that I would imagine will follow on from the work that we're setting out to do. Among them is information assurance and cybersecurity impacts and recommendations for what to do with xAPI implementations to secure them.
Yeah, and that question came in from Larry Reeves, who's with the Navy. And I do know Larry firsthand. The Navy has been already doing some xAPI prototypes, and they're using CAC, PKI for authentication in terms of that addresses information assurance. But also, in the DoD update that we made in terms of policy, we made several references to existing DoD cybersecurity policies, which are outside the scope of the specification, but it's still up to the DoD components to comply and implement those independent of their xAPI implementation. So those kind of have an overarching influence no matter what. Another policy that we referenced was records management. There's some DoD policies in regards to managing personal data, not just personal identifiable information, but other things like pertaining to their learning records. So that is all addressed in the policy as well. Those are, I think, really bigger policy issues than anything has to do with technical in terms of xAPI.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Is there a clear rule of how this crowdsourcing works? What will decide what goes into the official requirements for certification?
So I would say that there is no clear rule. I would say I will make it as clear as I can at this time, and understanding that we still need to write policies where we need to write policies. When it comes to the idea of conformance requirements, that is a wholly open community effort. Everything's going to be done out in the open. The participation we expect is going to be from the existing spec community and possibly from outside of it as well. And with the information and the links that we've made available, that's really the primary means of how not only people can participate, but also how decisions are going to get made. It's likely to be very much a ad hoc. If people care enough and they're participating, and we decide that these things are in, and these are the things that are in. It's a community process where it's not something that necessarily has one particular evaluator of what is a good requirement versus not. If it's a requirement, if it's a conformance requirement, it's really based on the spec and vendor and implementer understandings of what that means. When it comes to certification, that is a slightly different process. The requirements gathering is completely, we're opening that to the world because the world is really it's everybody in the world that is a stakeholder in that part of the process. The decisions of what will go into as a certification recommendation at this time, because we're not necessarily getting into developing a certification program yet. We're just figuring out what the real requirements are in the design of our program and what those recommendations might be. And those decisions will likely be vetted by members of the Data Interoperability Standards Consortium. And I know that opens up a whole line of questions as to what that membership means, and I'm not prepared yet to go into that on this call. That said, we'll release details on that really in the next couple of weeks, and that will, the reasons why are fairly obvious. When you have vendors creating products and you have now testing to certify products for stakeholders, purchasers, customers. Those are the kinds of people that need to be at the same table together to help sort out what is actually needed from a software certification standpoint. Okay, and so in order to mediate we actually get those people at the table, it's not. The work products are going to be opened up in terms of software certification, but that process is going to be kind of restricted to DISC members. Now, any member of DISC is going to be able to participate in that, so it's a pretty low bar, but that's the bar.
Yeah, and just to comment further on that, I think, ADL is going to bless the certification process and procedures that come out of this. So that's, a big part of the goals of getting this knocked out is, I think that's a later objective of the DISC BAA. But yeah. A couple other questions here, Aaron. I think we have some time. So next one comes in from Ben Betts. He says, have you outlined the likely commercial cost to vendors wishing to undertake the various processes on offer? If not, can you ballpark or suggest on what basis any cost will be created?
I need to parse that out of the British in which Ben asked that question. So, have I outlined the likely commercial cost of vendors to undertake the various processes on offer? If the cost is the processes of determining these requirements and recommendations, I'll have details to share on that specifically about the cost of membership and membership dues and things like that in the coming weeks. If you're talking about what it may cost for certification testing, I have no idea about that right now. That's really going to be, I'm really hoping to leave that to things that will be decided, through by the members who are going to participate in that effort. That's all I got on that.
Okay, that's fine. More of a comment here from Bill McDonald. Experience has taught me, AICC Test Lab certification, for example, that conformance testing procedures may have additional requirements in order to conduct a test. If you do not meet these extra requirements, it does not mean that you're not compliant. It does mean that compliance cannot be verified. Just a comment there from Bill. That's a good point. Marco, do you think to allow interoperability with the Moodle LMS? I think that's probably outside the scope of this call. Sorry, I should have filled that question a little bit better. Another question from Russell Duan. So the public's never going to get the chance to look at the two lists together and provide commentary until after those decisions are supposed to have been made within the timeline. And this is going to an earlier question Russell was asking about the deliverable from Rustici and DISC. Just to give a little bit of background, so it may seem like there's some overlap in those two deliverables, but they're kind of different in their approach. And Aaron, feel free to amplify what I'm talking about here. The Rustici effort too also was based off of our DoD work where we're updating the policy and look at the technical challenges around implementing the DoD and the DoD. So one of the things they identified was this conformance testing effort. And as a follow-on, they've been doing some work to start on gathering conformance test requirements. And they started with the original list that was out there. They started a few months back before DISC came under contract. So there's a little bit of a gap between when these efforts got started. And under the direction of our director at ADL, we wanted to have 2 independent efforts working on this task so that we could do a comparison and see the delta between the efforts and see if there were anything identified between the 2 gaps we missed, or also to see if they identified some of the same requirements that would just further validate that those were even more critical. So Russell's comments were about making those public, and we didn't want to make those public because we didn't want the results of one to influence the other. And the timeline is the end of September for the DISC one, so we'll probably share both of those with the public when they're both made available. I know it's probably a long-winded answer to the question, but
I would only just add on very, very briefly, which is surprising for me, that what we put out in terms of an initial list of conformance requirements, both by DISC and whatever final set of requirements exists that accounts for any deltas between what Rusty Software's put together and what we've put together in the community. This is a first step, and I think that the approach of doing it, having somebody kind of focus on the technical stuff and ram through it so that there is at least an option A, and then what we do as an option B, and then looking at those things together, competing, contrast, however you want to put that, makes for a better set of requirements to start from, and so that's why we're going there. At least that's how we're looking at it.
Thanks, Aaron. So yeah, I had another question related to that. Inga was asking, will ADL provide a comparison of these 2 documents? I think ultimately, whether it's a comparison of the documents, what the end goal is to have this definitive list of requirements. So whether it's a report or whether it's the final list, as Aaron was talking about, this is the first stab, and it could go through some refinement before we get that nailed down. But that is the ultimate goal, is to come up with these requirements list. Had another comment come in from Nick Washburn. He said, there's a list of current requirements publicly available, and you can participate in this effort. I think he's referring to the website that you mentioned earlier, Aaron, where you're posting those and trying to get votes and community engagement.
Absolutely.
Okay. Another comment back from Ben Betts. He says, we often struggle between being conformant and being legal in certain geographies. Frankly, being legal wins. Will conformance/certification base itself on U.S. data protection regulations at the expense of commie Europeans? And yes, you have to read commie.
I think it's actually better that you have the ADL guy read commie. I think that's much more funny. It's a really good hard question, Ben, and we're gonna have to really think about where the overlaps are or the intersections are between data privacy policy and the requirements that are inherent or assumed or implied by what's in the spec, and honestly, figure out what parts might we need to abstract based on how international this spec is, and think also through how there may be conflicts in the internationalization of meeting these legalities, and so yeah, that's a good, hard, complex question. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I don't think we can test for all legality, and we don't want to be responsible for saying yes, this product is 100% legal. That's just too much liability.
What I would say is this. I think there's another question in here that about I'm sorry, I got lost here for a second. But I thought there was something about like if everything's got to be done by the end of September, is there not going to be any time to revisit this later? And what I want to reiterate is that our deliverable, based on the agreements the binding agreements that we had to have with, just to get something off the ground, we need to have a deliverable of these conformance requirements for any number of reasons by the end of September. That doesn't mean that the work on the conformance requirements stops in November. It just means that we're going to have an initial list to ADL and the community by the end of September. So to that point, we may start with what we can do, which is the assumption on U.S. data protection regulations. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how we end up, and I would say that that's of help. It looks like there is another question from Nick, and it's a good question too. Does DISC or ADL make the final decision on the requirements? In terms of our deliverable to ADL, DISC makes those decisions. In terms of what honestly goes into the spec test that ADL is developing, it's probably ADL.
Right. There's probably a balance between what is technically possible of supporting with a test versus what is a implied requirement versus explicit requirement. But yeah, that's a good point. I think ultimately too, like the effort that DISC is starting with voting on the requirements using the kind of community forum, ultimately the community is going to help decide on those requirements.
Yeah, I mean, I really do feel strongly, and I hope that the community sees it this way too, that we are truly have a mandate from ADL to act as an extension of ADL and really help bring the community together in a way that is more engaging than the resources that are internal to ADL really had the time to do, given all the things that are on their plates. So, I feel very strongly that the participation in this effort is really the voice of the community coming directly to ADL and directly influencing those decisions.
Yeah, definitely, and hopefully that gets at some of those questions. If not, feel free to follow up, everyone, and we'll talk through the offline if we didn't answer those quite right. It's kind of hard sometimes to infer through this question pane maybe exactly what was being asked. Let's see. I think that's it. I don't see any more questions coming in, at least not a ton of them.
I see that there was one question about let's just go right into it. Will xAPI conformance requirements cover anything around Caliper if an LRS supports both xAPI and Caliper? It's not really in our scope or mandate to even consider building a conformance test or conformance requirements for Caliper. IMS has already done all of that. They have a certification program for Caliper. So, if anything, if eventually there is a profile of xAPI, whether it to work with Caliper or some other link between xAPI and Caliper, we'll look at those requirements and test and develop requirements around that and then test for that. There is a survey active right now on whether or not they actually have, there is a mandate from the community to work with Caliper, work on something between xAPI and Caliper. Whether or not you have an opinion, seriously, whether or not you have an opinion, if you have no opinion, please state you have no opinion on the matter. But please take the survey, because the messages that come, the findings of that survey should reflect the community, the whole community, not just the people who really want that to happen, and not just the parts that really don't care. It should reflect as democratically as possible and representative of the entire community, so that we have a sense of what kind of resources should be committed to doing that.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Aaron. I was going to try to post a link in the chat, but I don't see that it's working. If you go to adlnet.gov and scroll down to the bottom of the page, you should see a announcement link, like blog post, to the xAPI and Caliper review. So that's what Aaron's talking about. There's a link to the survey in there. Like, we're actually trying to figure out what is the feasibility of doing, an integration with Caliper, and we like you said, we need your input to actually inform that. So I don't think, to answer that question, of course, we can't, that's not part of the scope of this testing effort right now. The scope is LRS conformance, and then maybe eventually learning record provider or profile testing. So, another part that Aaron's mentioned is the certification of the processes. And one thing I think I want to mention here before we try to wrap things up is that this is the first of many community efforts that's going to be ongoing with ADL and DISC to look at supporting these efforts. Right now it's conformance, but the certification process and the index and things that's going to be built, the processes that support that, we're going to need your feedback in supporting those efforts as well. So this is just the beginning. I think a lot of great work to come.
All right, I see two other questions, and I think that we probably should curtail this webinar after that, just because we're running along. First, from Andrew Hickey: will the requirements look to cover hard to define metrics such as performance? So I think that if those are things that the community is suggesting, we're going to look at them, whether or not they make it into technical conformance requirements, or whether we start looking at them from a practice-based approach, or we look elsewhere other than the LRS to test those things. That remains to be seen. So on the surface of the question, I'd be rash in saying no, it won't. But because I really want to understand better the question, but again, that's what the process is for, is to vet out, what are the ideas about interoperability are really important, and how best can we support them. And then the last question is, will the certification test just focus on basic xAPI conformance, or will it test against xAPI profiles as well? That's from Bill McDonald. The initial mandate is really to just look at the LRS itself, the conformant to xAPI as a spec by itself. Now, that said, in every conceivable way, we recognize, both personally and professionally, the importance of being able to test for the conformance of profiles, and eventually to certify that things actually work with profiles. But how we do that is yet to be determined. I mean, that's a whole research activity in and of itself, beyond even just figuring out the conformance requirements and how to test for them with just the spec that we've had for 3 years. So we recognize that that's really important, and that's going to have to be dealt with much sooner than later. Maybe even following our work, that's going to be something that people start getting into. But it's not in our initial scope.
Yep, excellent. And learning record provider certification, professional certification is another thing that's in scope later too in FY17. So a lot of great things coming. As Aaron mentioned, we're kind of getting close to running out of time here, so I'd like to maybe close things off with that last question from Bill. I don't see any other ones. I do see from Ingo Don. He mentioned there are many links. Maybe we could provide a link to a list with all these. There were a lot of great resources shared today. I'll work with Aaron, and we'll follow up with providing you all with a link to the recording, as well as all of the other resources provided during the discussion today. Want to thank everyone for coming out, and we look forward to your participation in this effort with ADL and DISC and our conformance and certification strategy for this year and next year. Thank you so much. And thank you, Aaron.